My name is Tamara Kharroub. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I'm pleased to be chairing this panel discussion looking at U.S. global influence amidst the Gaza war, implications for U.S. foreign policy, and the international law-based order. As many of you know, the wars in Gaza and Ukraine have exposed the hypocrisy and double standards of Western nations, especially the United States. For several months after October 7, the US defied the international community and violated its own laws and obligations by blocking 3 ceasefire resolutions at the UN Security Council, by obstructing the work of the ICJ and the ICC in preventing genocide and the violations of international humanitarian law, and by continuing to fund and militarily supply Israel's war on Gaza. All of these have undermined US global influence, standing, and ability to invoke international law elsewhere. The Western-led global order, which was established after World War II, enshrined humanitarian protections into international law through the Geneva Conventions. But the double standards and the failure to uphold international law in Gaza are promoting the erosion of this order and will have wider, lasting implications for justice efforts around the world. But this international system has already been broken, as it was rooted in systematic inequality, has been applied selectively, and is controlled by the global North to serve the interests of the North and shield its allies from accountability. And yet, this stark moment today, that of the Gaza war, will have lasting and harmful consequences for the world and for the global governing principles, far beyond Gaza and well after this war. This last session of the conference will discuss the impact of American policy towards the Gaza war on its global influence and standing, implications for the rules-based order and for international law, and explore some recommendations for a constructive US policy under the next administration. Have the Gaza war and the West's reaction to it produced a new global order? Is the global North losing influence to small and medium states in the global South, who now have the capacity to organize and influence globally? Is this the emergence of a plural and decentralized order and the breakdown of Western supremacy and monopoly over it? How can we reform the international legal system? What role should the next US administration play in the new global system? To address these important issues, we are fortunate to have an excellent panel of experts for this final session today. I will briefly introduce them in speaking order, and you can find more detailed bios in the program book. First, unfortunately, Hisham Hellyer had a last-minute flight cancellation and was unable to get to DC on time, but he did send a video which we will play. Hisham is a Senior Associate Fellow in International Security Studies at the Royal United Service Institute and is also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Phyllis Bennis is a fellow and director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Wadie E is professor of law and Dean's Faculty Fellow at the University of Colorado School of Law. Sarah Yager is the Washington Director of Human Rights Watch. Thanks to all of you for being with us today, and I look forward to the discussion. Before we begin, I would like to remind the audience you can send in your questions at any time to the panelists. Those of you in the room, please use the question cards provided. If you have a questions, please raise the card and we will collect those from you. People watching us online, Feel free to use the Q&A feature on Zoom or send in your questions by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. And now we will begin the discussion with our first speaker, Hisham H.A. Hellyer. In his recorded video, Hisham will focus on the impact of U.S. policies on the international system, the breakdown of the global rules-based order, and the emergence of a new order. And we'll play his video.
From the outset, I want to thank Dr. Tamara Kharoub, the moderator for this panel, to Khalil Jahshan for the kind invitation, to Lena Kattan for all the logistical assistance that she gave me, and to Marvin Perry for the help that he provided. I have to say I wanted very much to be with all of you in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club today, but as a result of flight cancellations and extreme delays, it turned out to be a challenge that just wasn't to be surmounted. But I've no doubt you have had an excellent conference already, as the engagement I received already with the Arab Center showed them to be a deeply professional institution, and I look forward to the next opportunity. The panel this afternoon is entitled U.S. Global Influence Amidst the Gaza War, Implications for U.S. Foreign Policy and International Law-Based Order. As a brief introduction to my own frame of reference, I offer my comments as somebody who's been in 3 different think tanks in Washington, D.C. over the last 17 years. And so I hope something of a familiarity with the policy arena in that regard. But I spend much of my time between Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, hopefully providing in my comments today something of a more globally reflective perspective, as much as that might be possible. In the Beltway, as is so often within the Beltway, the discussion about U.S. global influence amidst the Gaza war is very little about Gaza and very little about global influence, and it's mostly about the United States and most particularly within the Beltway. And therein I find few are particularly concerned about the breakdown of U.S. global influence due to the Gaza war for 2 main reasons. One reason is that within this small policy community, opinion on Gaza is split between those who are vocally in opposition to Israel's war in Gaza, those who are silently also opposed, and those who are vocally in support of Israel's war. This last group is the largest one in the Beltway and probably the majority. The second reason is that there continues to be an impression that the US just doesn't need the world anyway, which leads directly into our discussion. I remember some months ago being asked to engage with a senior policymaker from another DC think tank. And when I raised the issue of the global South being rather of a different mind to the Beltway on Gaza, the response was, "What has the global South done for us lately anyway?" It speaks volumes to have senior voices in the Beltway reflect that kind of sentiment, which I think is unfortunately rather widespread. Going beyond the Beltway, however, consider this, because I think we often forget. All of these discussions in Washington, D.C. are incredibly isolated. They're frankly exotic and not in an eye-catching sort of way. If you go beyond Washington and you look at public opinion polls in the US, opposition to the Gaza war is in the majority. If you look across the West, public opinion is opposed to Israel's war in Gaza. If you look even across Western governments, a vast majority wants the war to end. When we look at South America, when we look at Asia, Africa, all the signs are very clear. This portion of opinion in the Beltway that supports Israel in its war is at odds with pretty much everywhere else, save some, not all, but some conservative opinion in Western Europe and, of course, Israel. Look at the United Nations, where the General Assembly overwhelmingly, more than 2/3, demanded that Israel end its unlawful presence in occupied Palestinian territory, and less than 8% opposed that demand. Look at the International Court of Justice, which issued the advisory opinion that confirmed the basis of that demand, but also found the accusation of genocide being carried out in Gaza by Israel to be plausible enough to warrant a case. Look at the International Criminal Court, where the prosecutor has been pushing for arrest warrants to be issued for Israel's prime minister and defense minister. One could list a litany of public statements by Joseph Borrell, the EU's foreign representative, numerous heads of state who spoke at the United Nations this past week, diplomats and foreign ministers, speech after speech this week condemned the war in Gaza and now also the war in Lebanon, and condemned Israel for its campaign. Even countries that are historically quite friendly with Israel and quite critical of it have been loath to do much but critique it now for very pragmatic and strategic reasons. To give an illustrative example, when Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, the government of Singapore not only strongly condemned the Russian aggression, but also imposed unilateral sanctions. It was a move that one could argue was short-sighted because Singapore's closer relationship to Russia than Ukraine, for example. But it did so less because of Ukraine as an ally and more out of a recognition that if big countries could invade smaller ones without consequence, then a rules-based order underpinned by international law was a myth and of little consequence. And that was threatening to Singapore as a smaller power. Today, when it comes to Gaza, Singapore is also quite critical of Israel's moves and has been clear on this point at the United Nations and otherwise. This is despite the fact that Singapore is probably Israel's closest ally in Southeast Asia. But again, because the overall nature of the rules-based order is being deeply challenged by Israel's war therein, which is deemed internationally to be in direct violation of numerous articles of international law. But there's another uncomfortable aspect here to be noted, which hits at the rules-based order in particular and is of special importance to the United States and this policy community. In the Russia-Ukraine case, it is an American adversary, Russia, that has invaded and occupied part of an American ally, Ukraine, and the United States is helping its ally repel the invasion. And while the world may not necessarily take America's side in this, as the conflict is often presented as a proxy war of sorts, it is difficult to find many who would argue that Russia's invasion was legal according to international law. But the discomfort then arises with what happens in the Israel-Gaza case. In this case, it's an American ally that is invaded and occupied. Today, Gaza, tomorrow, quite possibly Lebanon, if not by the time this message is being heard. The US is not helping the occupied in this case. The US is actively assisting the occupier, despite its statements on wanting a ceasefire. And I happen to believe all of those statements, but with a very important proviso. The Biden administration doesn't want the ceasefire enough. Otherwise, the administration would use the leverage that it has on Israel to ensure one. Worse than that, the United States is claiming that this is all in line with the rules-based order, in line with international law, and even in line with its own domestic laws. The National Security Council claimed that the State Department found no incidents in which Israel violated international humanitarian law. The Leahy laws on arms transfers have not been upheld, despite Senate Majority Whip Dick Durbin expressing concerns about inconsistent applications of the law in that regard. DC has threatened the International Criminal Court and the prosecutor due to the proposed arrest warrants of Netanyahu and Gallant, and so on and so on. Even in ordinarily pro-Israel countries, there is now concern about the impact that the administration's behavior will have on the rules-based order, and a growing worry that this order is being brought into disrepute. And again, this is not simply because of Israel's actions, but because the most powerful member of the bloc that proclaims itself to be the main guarantor of the rules-based order is denying that any violations are taking place, and simultaneously vigorously supporting the state that stands accused of violating that order. The breakdown of the rules-based order in that regard is a very serious prospect, and one that we need to take seriously. What we see in the global south is the beginning of a recognition that it cannot wait for the United States to get its proverbial act together. That it may well be that the US is sleepwalking or even deliberately hurtling towards a world where the rules-based order becomes further fragmented. There are some that view this with some degree of enthusiasm out of frustration and anger at what has been allowed to happen to transpire already. Ask the people of Bosnia about the rules-based order following the genocide of the 90s, or the invasion of Iraq in 2003, or the tyranny of the Assad regime in Syria, and of course the decades-long occupation of the Palestinians, and quite a number of other atrocities that have taken place over recent decades. There's likely to be a lot of cynicism. But the path ahead is very unclear and deeply concerning. There are unanswered questions about what parts of the rules-based order would survive in a new phase, what parts would be replaced, and by what, if certain parts are likely to be more based on law, while other parts simply on might is right, with the might coming simply from somewhere else than Washington, D.C. It's not as simple as declaring that South Africa's path in relying on the International Court of Justice will suddenly form the basis of the entirety of a new global order. Even if it ought to, it won't do so simply by chance or by default. It would have to be as the result of a much more direct and impressive engagement. Rather, what we are likely to see is that if the US continues to allow the current rules-based order to fragment further, by failing to hold its own ally accountable when it comes to the Palestinians and the wider Arab world region, other, far more unpredictable power arrangements for particularly middling powers in the global south will take hold. The medium to long-term impact of that is unpredictable. At some point, there will be another crisis in the Middle East or somewhere else about territory, the climate crisis, or other issues. When those crises hit, we will all need more, not fewer mechanisms for de-escalation and mediation, because the alternatives are likely to be even worse than we can imagine. That means that responsibility for upholding a rules-based order based on international law becomes ever more important, even if, as time goes on, it becomes ever more difficult. And in the heart of the Beltway, where all of you are today, responsibility for that, considering American power, is paramount. With that, I thank you for all the attention you provided me over the past 10 minutes or so, and I do wish I was there to engage in questions and answers, but I hope to be there at the next annual conference. My thanks and appreciation again.
Thanks to Hisham for sending this message, and next we move to Phyllis Bennis, and focusing a little bit more on the United States and its policies and relations with Israel. Phyllis, could you tell us a little bit more about U.S. policy? Why has the U.S. chosen to take this path with Israel? We've seen this week at the UN, the U.S. and Israel are increasingly more and more isolated at the world stage. Is Israel becoming a strategic liability for the United States? And maybe a little bit more if you could reflect on the future of U.S. power and influence after this phase that we're going through, the genocide right now.
Well, thanks, Tamara, and thanks to the Arab Center and to all of you for participating in this. So important to have these discussions as we're trying to sort out this moment. I think I would start with this question of the rules-based international order that we're hearing so much about. I would disagree a little bit, I think, with Ken Roth, who spoke about it earlier, when he talked about the likelihood that Kamala Harris is already and will in the future leave out key components of those rules. I actually don't think that's the case. I think there's a very specific campaign underway to replace international law with something called the international rules-based order, because that doesn't exist. There are no rules. The rules are what somebody in Washington says they are at any given moment, right? So it's not about a rules-based order based on international law. It's about a, quote, rules-based international order instead of international law. Because international law, you know, you can argue about the meanings of certain things. You can argue about interpretations. But the laws exist. They're in the books. You can read them, or they're online these days. I mean, some people still have books. But there's a sense, I think, that we ignore at our peril, that this language, I must say I'm a bit surprised to hear it so broadly here. So many people have used it here, and I'm like, wait, no, don't do that, don't use that. Don't give it that credibility. This is not the new way of talking about international law. This is how we're getting away from international law, so that things that happen that are in clear violation of international law in all its iterations, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, et cetera, get put aside in favor of, we want to go back to when things were calm, which is defined as the lack of resistance from those for whom the order is not very rules-based at all. So I start with that because I think it's an important component of how we look at these questions. You know, at the end of the Cold War, when we moved into the period of what I always used to call the GWAT, it was one of those great acronyms that really sounded like the evil that it was, the Global War on Terror. One of the aspects of that was the end of any claim about the legitimacy of international law to have anything to say about the US and its allies going to war. So it was different with Bush Jr. than with his father. Bush Sr. worked very, very hard at the UN to force using bribes and threats and punishments of all kinds, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, got the UN to do his bidding and endorse the idea of going to war against Iraq. A decade later, Bush Jr. tries a little bit, gets the Brits on board, you know, tries to do something to get everybody to move in the Security Council to endorse the war. And you have the rise of the uncommitted six. I think some people here probably are old enough to remember that, when you had, you know, 6 countries of the global south who individually would never have the capacity, the ability, the willingness, the will to challenge the US. They were Angola, Cameroon, Guinea, Mexico, Chile, Pakistan. I used to know them much better than that. But those 6 stood together to say, no, we're not going to endorse this war. And it lasted for 8 months. For 8 months, the United Nations was part of this global mobilization against war in Iraq, which was an extraordinary thing, even though ultimately it did not stop the war. Because when the US and the Brits finally sort of publicly threw in the towel and said, well, we're not going to do this anymore, we're not going to try and get a UN approval, a lot of people thought, oh my God, they're not going to go to war? We're winning here? And it turned out they were just planning to go to war without the UN. They didn't care that it violated international law. And I think that was in a certain way the beginning of this notion of the rules-based international order, because it allowed illegal acts to go forward saying it's within our rules. Our rules said this is about self-defense or this is about weapons of mass destruction. The fact that they didn't exist had nothing to do with it. All we needed was the assertion of it. So I think we're now facing a moment, as you say, Tamara, of enormous and rising, and rising isolation of the United States. Israel has been isolated for a long time, but it's of little relevance to Israel because it has full dependency on the United States grant of not only billions of dollars of our tax money every year, virtually unlimited access to all the weapons of the world and its own nuclear arsenal, but it also can rely on impunity provided by the United States. So that when we hear President Biden, I'm thinking of earlier presidents too, but when we hear President Biden say, we need a ceasefire, which took him a very long time to say, and we should give credit for that to the uncommitted movement, which forced the White House to shift that policy statement, not the policy, but the policy language had to shift because of that pressure. We still see this sense of, I'm not going to do the one thing that would make it happen. So saying really loud, we need a ceasefire now, or whispering it in Bibi Netanyahu's ear, doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you say, as long as you are continuing to send all the weapons they need. Because then they can afford to dismiss you out of hand. And Netanyahu can campaign as the one guy who can control our relationship with the United States. So I think that what we saw coming out of that in the context of the Gaza war was that an awful lot of people have been and continue to ask the wrong question. I wrote a piece about this in The Nation not too long ago, some of you may have seen it, that the wrong question that so many of us, because I was part of this and am in some ways too, the wrong question is, how do we get people who say they cannot bring themselves to vote for anybody from this administration that is carrying out genocide, that is enabling genocide, that is arming and paying for genocide? How do we convince them to vote for the new, whether it was going to be Biden or now Harris, how do we get them to vote for them anyway? And it's the wrong question, partly because there's probably no way, because it's a position based on moral reality and moral courage and moral strength that is not going to be something that people are going to listen to. Oh, that's a new argument. Oh, okay, I guess I was wrong. I'll change my mind. One, it's not going to work. But two, it's the wrong question because genocide is underway today, and it's not just about our election. Wherever people stand on that spectrum of how different will it be, how much difference is there between a Biden administration, a Harris administration, and a Trump administration, whatever your view is on that, wherever you put yourself on that spectrum, the reality is the right question, and unfortunately I don't have the answer to it, is what else can we do to force an end to the genocide today? This isn't just about elections. It can't be. Because Joe Biden is going to be the president for another 4 months, regardless of who gets elected, regardless of how much turmoil erupts from it. He's still going to be the president. And an awful lot of people are going to die in Gaza. A lot more children are going to be killed in Gaza during those 4 months if we don't come up with new ways for our movements. And this is the key notion, I think, that becomes so important. So I think, you know, in this context where international law is really not on the agenda of the powerful, we are now in a position to make it part of our agenda. And part of that has to do with South Africa. Part of it has to, in two ways. Part of it has to do with the new initiative that the South Africans have taken, which has been such an extraordinary thing to watch. Not only the notion of standing on principle, the one government in the world that still has, for how long, nobody knows, but still for the moment has the kind of moral claim that no other government does because of its history in overthrowing apartheid. What other government could have had the moral credibility, the moral credential to go to the International Court of Justice and say, we want Israel brought up on charges of violating the terms of the Convention Against the Convention Against Genocide. And in doing so, said to the whole world that these institutions like the ICJ, like the ICC, don't belong just to the white colonials anymore. It's not just yours. The Global South gets to have some use of these things too. And we are going to break that taboo that said only the rich and powerful countries and the white colonial countries, which tend to be the same thing, what a surprise. Not entirely, but somewhat. That they are now part of the powerful who can go to the International Court of Justice and bring up on charges one of the most powerful countries in the region, the closest Middle East ally of the wealthiest, militarily most powerful country in the history of the world, and have the court move in that direction. That has been extraordinary. And there's another part of it that becomes crucial, and this goes back to the fact that the court, as we know, doesn't have an army to implement its decisions. It doesn't even have, as far as I can tell, a couple of police officers to like do process serving or something like that. They have nothing except the credibility of what they stand for, that they are the highest court in the world, representing the United Nations, much more than the International Criminal Court, much more than anything else. But within that, they turn the enforcement power and the obligation, which is the key part, over to other countries, every country that is a signatory to the International Covenant Against the Crime of Genocide, has an obligation to do whatever it can to prevent a genocide, and if a genocide happens, to stop the genocide. And the court reminded countries of that. And then it turned over to the United Nations, as it did with the advisory opinion on the illegality of the occupation and apartheid itself, the whole system. It turned that over for enforcement and implementation to the General Assembly. And the model there is the model of the South African struggle against apartheid. in the 70s and 80s, when again, using the veto, the US, and somewhat the Brits, but especially the US, over and over and over again in the Security Council, vetoing any effort to impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa. But when those same resolutions were passed over and over and over again in the General Assembly, a different thing happened. They didn't have any power to enforce it. They're not enforceable, says the US. We don't have to listen to that. Well, fine, but other governments, other countries did. Not just on their own, but because people were mobilized in the cities and in the countryside of countries all around the world, so that it became impossible for other governments to stop themselves from imposing those sanctions, from cutting off ties with the military in South Africa, from imposing banking sanctions, corporate sanctions, all those things. And eventually, when virtually every other country in the world had already done so, the US was essentially shamed into it, led by the Black Caucus of the Congress, at a time when the Black Caucus was, in many ways, the conscience of the Congress. And at that time, what you saw was the Congress ultimately was able to vote to impose sanctions. And yes, Ronald Reagan vetoed it, and they got enough votes to override the veto and finally impose those sanctions on South Africa that played a huge role in leading to the overthrow of apartheid itself. So in both of those ways, both in terms of the challenge to the historical limits on who gets to use those limitations, and in terms of the role of the General Assembly, that becomes increasingly important. And I would end with just raising two components of this in terms of what we do, what our movements do. One is on the domestic side. In the year since October 7th, there has been the eruption of an enormous, broad, wide movement demanding a ceasefire. And what that movement has done has been to redefine what ceasefire means. So the call for ceasefire, there's been a kind of message discipline that the Palestine movement is not known for. But there's been this incredible level of message discipline. But what people mean when they say ceasefire now is not just stop the bombing. It's, yeah, stop the bombing, stop killing people, and refund UNRWA and allow in a massive amount, all that's needed of humanitarian aid, and stop sending the weapons, because that's what enables the war. So that's what our domestic goal is. We're operating closer to power than ever before. In the international arena, our goal to force the UN to reopen the Committee Against Apartheid, looking at the new apartheid power in the world, which is Israel. There are others as well, but Israel is preeminent among them, and to impose the arms sanctions as a starting point, just the way it happened with South Africa. Eventually, the US will be forced by domestic pressure and by international pressure, but it's up to our movement to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis, for this, and thank you for bringing up the point on the issue of the rules-based order. There's been a lot of discussion about whether we want this rules-based order or focus on a law-based order, and I think that's a really important point. And that brings me to our next speaker, Wadie E, who will focus on international law in general. Wadie, if you could basically address the issue of where Palestine and the Gaza war fit in international law today, and is there a Palestine exception, or is it just simply a reflection of the colonial powers that established those legal measures? And Phyllis mentioned a little bit about the issues of enforcement and obligations of different states under international law, and this has been one of the biggest challenges. Not just for Gaza and Palestine, but in general. If you could address these issues, that would be great.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Tamara, and thank you to the Arab Center for having me, to Lana for helping get me here, and Dr. Jahshan also. You know, it's interesting because I was listening to what Phyllis was saying and what you just also mentioned, Tamara, and, you know, I think what my remarks are geared to kind of show is how kind of unserious the United States position is on international law and how it's creating this type of backlash. Backlash is maybe an unfortunate word, a kind of a response. A lot of responses I'm going to talk about in my remarks here, but it's creating the conditions for a positive response that will maybe change the United States chokehold on how international law gets interpreted, specifically with respect to the issue of Palestine. So basically, I'm going to reflect on the legal dimensions of the current genocide and ask the question of how we can make sense of the role of developments in international law over this past year, especially when we consider that issue of the U.S.'s position in response. Now, I'm sure all of you have followed the case in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, involving South Africa's action against the State of Israel. So in January, the ICJ ruled that basically under the 1948 Genocide Convention, there was a plausible genocide taking place in Gaza. Now that's a lower evidentiary threshold than a finding of genocide on the merits, which will take many, many, many years of legal proceedings and rulings, et cetera, to establish. The last one we saw where the case proceeded to a decision on the merits was the case of Bosnia versus Serbia, and maybe we'll have time to discuss that, but I don't know. The discourse with respect to the first ruling in January was a little bit puzzling. Much attention was paid to the fact that basically the ICJ didn't order a ceasefire, right? Which it doesn't have a military, it doesn't have the force to be able to do that. But from the first provisional measure in that ruling, you could tell that stopping the attacks on Palestinians in Gaza was paramount. After all, it said the State of Israel shall, under the convention, take all measures within its power, et cetera, to stop killing members of the group. I mean, that's, in essence, akin to a ceasefire. So this discussion of it doesn't order a ceasefire was, I think, a little bit overblown. A subsequent March ruling basically ordered the provision of humanitarian relief to prevent famine and starvation. Again, now, did that happen? Of course not. However, we've seen the United States, the Israelis constantly say there's no famine, there's no starvation. Well, here we have the ICJ basically stating that opinion. It's what we oftentimes, I think lawyers, I'm one, so I guess I'm guilty of this as well, right? We have this idea that you can litigate everything and create the solution by the court issuing a ruling in your favor. Obviously, it doesn't work like that in domestic civil cases, let alone in international disputes before the World Court. Further, in May, the ICJ, in the South Africa case, ruled that the Israeli military had to halt its offensive on the city of Rafah in the Gaza Strip. What has been the United States' response here? It basically says this whole action is meritless. That's the phrase they used, that John Kirby used and Anthony Blinken used. They said this is meritless. It's ridiculous, the idea that Israel is engaged in a genocide. Okay, what's the reasoning? What's the evidence behind this? They haven't bothered really to tell us, right? They just kind of state it as if how absurd that this issue gets raised. And this reminds me of, in July of 2022, President Biden said a similar thing in a different context, that is, this idea of apartheid, Israel engaging in basically enforcing an apartheid regime in the area of the territory between the river and the sea. He said, we're not going to call it apartheid. Why not? No, we're just not going to do it. And we're seeing also that this approach is engendering a real kind of a real sense of this can't go unanswered. This can't be how it is, especially in light of a genocide. Further developments in the context of the International Criminal Court, a separate judicial body, right, also housed in The Hague in the Netherlands. There we've seen the prosecutor's office request arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister, along with the now head of the Hamas political wing, Yahya Sinwar, along with the leader of the military wing of the Islamic resistance movement, the Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, a fellow by the name of Mohammed Deif, who may or may not have been killed, and also against Ismail Haniyeh, who was killed. This took place in May. And essentially, the prosecutor, the chief ICC prosecutor, a British lawyer by the name of Karim Khan, who was well known, right, before any of this happened, to have been a very acceptable candidate to the Americans and the Israelis. The Israelis even had said that. There's a memo out there from the Israeli Foreign Ministry saying the appointment of Karim Khan is more than acceptable to us. Well, after all the violence and all the killing by the Israeli military in Gaza, he was moved to act. Of course, he had 2 Israelis, 3 Palestinians, but now it's only at most 2. But still, even though that symbolism is powerful, the fact that he even took that step against Netanyahu and Gallant was quite something. We just learned at the beginning of this month, actually has gone back to the court to say, where are the arrest warrants? Why haven't they been issued? This is a matter of extreme urgency. So there's that developed. Finally, the most recent development in a case involving the ICJ's advisory jurisdiction. So the case involving South Africa and Israel is under the Genocide Convention. So the Israelis in that case, because they're a party to the Genocide Convention, they felt compelled to respond. In the advisory opinion, which is something that was voted on by the United Nations General Assembly, where they asked the World Court to issue an opinion on a matter of global concern, an advisory opinion, there it's perceived as non-binding because the parties, haven't really agreed. There's the advisory jurisdiction, the Genocide Convention jurisdiction, and then there's something called contentious jurisdiction, which hasn't come up yet, where the two state parties to a dispute agree for the matter to be heard by the World Court. Because this was an advisory opinion regarding the legality of the occupation, the Israelis didn't feel compelled to respond. In fact, they said this is just a witch hunt against their country, like they did 20 years earlier in the case involving the consequences of building a wall in the West Bank. And there, we've seen that the matter isn't simply stopping. The ICJ ruled in July that the entire occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem is unlawful, and that it should be ended with Israel obliged to pay reparations and pull out its settlers and settlements, etc. And the world, mostly the global South, but not exclusively, is not letting this one go. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution just a couple of weeks ago demanding implementation of this advisory opinion in its entirety within a year, meaning total withdrawal of Israeli military and settlers, and it called on the member states to take concrete measures to compel the Israeli state to do so. So we'll watch that space because individual nation states can impose their own version of sanctions on the Israelis, and now they have an actual legal blueprint and legal mandate to do so. The depressing part is, well, when we ask the question of what's the American response to this. As we've already noted, the U.S. rejects the ICJ's jurisdiction and rulings in these matters, and we have a background here. I'm sure many of you know that President Clinton signed the Rome Statute, but he knew the Senate would never ratify it. And when George W. Bush became president, he famously unsigned the Rome Statute. What that means is not entirely clear. But in addition, Congress in 2002 passed something called the American Service Members Protection Act, also known as the Hague Invasion Act, which basically authorizes the U.S. military to pick, or the U.S. forces to basically take any American who might be brought up for prosecution before the ICC and free them by force. And of course, we all know about, and this has been mentioned several times today, about the Trump administration sanctioning the ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, and her deputy, and their families, by the way, right, and denied them visas and froze their assets in the United States. There were calls to do that from people in Congress and in government here in D.C., but they have failed so far. Obviously, there was talk about what happens in a new administration is obviously something to be seen. But with respect to the advisory positions, the U.S. position is they are not binding or enforceable, so they're to be ignored, right? And that's in contrast with actions under the Genocide Convention, which the U.S. is a party to, so it is bound by rulings under under it. However, the binding point is a little bit overblown, if you ask me, because it's not as if, even in a matter involving a binding decision, that the United States would suddenly mobilize its troops to enforce the action. Basically, we're dealing with this in the context of also the Israeli response has also been much reduced. And this is, I think, back to Phyllis's point, where we've seen how the Israelis have been exposed as completely reliant on American aid. In response to the 2004 decision on the wall, the Israeli Supreme Court actually just came in and said, you know, actually, the World Court says it's interpreting, or the ICJ says it's interpreting international law. Actually, we also have a right to interpret international law, and wouldn't you know, we find that our building of a wall is legal under international law, with a couple of little exceptions, right? Now, in the wake of all that's passed and the fact that there's been these court reforms, Israeli court reforms, and the Israeli Supreme Court is much diminished, and the Israeli state and its sort of its place as a bastion of liberality in a hostile Middle East has been completely eviscerated in the view of most of the world. You wouldn't see the Israeli Supreme Court trying to rule on occupation and retaining any credibility. After all, it hasn't ruled on the issue of the legality of occupation because it doesn't want to confront the issue, because Israel doesn't believe it's an occupying power. It's ruled on aspects of occupation, but only because it purports to apply international law as a matter of fact, not law. So what is the kind of upshot of all this from an American perspective? Is we're still seeing the United States and its perception of international law. It's purely as a tool. So you see the rest of the international community is basically clamoring for international law to be respected, to be upheld, and to apply universally, whereas the United States sees it as a tool to deploy when it wants. What does it do when it doesn't want international law to be deployed? It acts unilaterally. So, for example, we know the U.S. has said already, the ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, has said, if Netanyahu shows up in New York, we're not going to arrest him, even if an arrest warrant were to have issued. What has the U.S. done in response? Well, it unveiled a criminal complaint against Hamas leaders, kind of as a counter to the ICC moves, right? There is no criminal complaint against any Israeli defendants based on the genocide in Gaza, but there is against Hamas leaders. And it's also, as usual with the United States operating in this regard, a little bit nonsensical. For example, they've put the former leader of Hamas, Khalid Mash'al, who's been retired for however long, who everyone in the Middle East who picks up a newspaper knows he had nothing to do with October 7th. He's not really even in the movement, but he's part of the criminal complaint. He's a named defendant. So there's a little bit of non-thinking there. There's also a history here in that from 2003 to 2008, there were a series of cases in American courts, one of which I actually worked on, involving the prosecution of Palestinian Americans for their nonviolent advocacy activities, which the government claimed were in support of either the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine or Hamas, which were, in most cases failed, but were largely, in my view, a witch hunt. And there was one particularly awful case called the Holy Land 5 case, which resulted in sentences of up to 65 years for the leaders of the largest Muslim charity in the United States, basically engaging in peaceful charitable activity not connected to any terrorist organizations. What's going on here? Well, there's a background. Like I said, the U.S. considers itself a world court. It's tried the former president of Honduras, the former security minister of Mexico, and it even arrested and then had to release the former defense minister of Mexico, right? These habits die hard, but we're seeing a lot of international resistance to them. And I have more, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Wadie. Thank you, Wadie, for this really thorough presentation, and I'm sure there's a lot more to be discussed, and hopefully we can get to it during the Q&A session. Next, we have Sarah Yager, and looking at hopefully the future of U.S. foreign policy. Sarah, you've written about the double standards in U.S.-Israel policy and their impacts. If you could touch a little bit on that, but also about maybe how can the United States ensure accountability for war crimes and the respect for human rights going forward, if that is, as candidate Harris has been claiming, the international law that we want to uphold. But also, if you could maybe give some policy recommendations for the next administration on this issue of the genocide in Gaza, if not for the values of international law and human rights, for U.S. long-term interests.
Thanks, Tamara. Are you sure that's it? Just it. Okay. Okay, in 10 minutes. I can actually probably do it in under 10 because some of this stuff is actually much more simple, I think, than we make it out to be. And thank you for the questions, because after those amazing presentations, my mind has gone down about 1 million rabbit holes, and I actually had no idea where to start. So thank you also to Wadie for going to law school, so I didn't have to. That was really great. It was actually a really good primer for me. I want to say two things about where I'm coming from. One is that Human Rights Watch has a very specific mandate, which is international law. So what we do is document human rights abuses and violations of international law around the world, and then try to get governments to change. My role within Human Rights Watch is to be here in Washington and try to get the United States to change, either to put pressure on other governments with whatever leverage it has to get them to change, or to stop creating human rights abuses or participating in human rights abuses itself. That means that I spend a ton of time at the White House, State Department, Pentagon, and I am delighted to be here. This is a much more engaging and fun conversation than those that I've been having over the past 11 months. And I also want to recognize just my privilege in being able to think about and work on Gaza without the absolutely tremendous suffering that so many people are experiencing. It's something that I take into consideration every day when I start this work from my very safe place here in Washington. I will say that I want to just take a little bit of issue in the characterization of what people inside the Beltway think. People inside the Beltway are not a monolith. The Biden administration is not a monolith. And what I have experienced, I don't think anyone in this room is happy with US policy on Israel or Gaza, but what I have experienced in Washington is actually that it is the leadership of the Biden administration that believes one thing, and pretty much everyone else in the executive, maybe even in Congress, believes something else. And what we have is a broken policy process, an intentionally broken policy process that has not allowed the majority of views that say we can no longer unconditionally support Israel's conduct in Gaza, does not allow those views to be heard or acted upon. So I won't get too much in the weeds because I could just completely wonk out on this, but policy process for who gets weapons and where and what they do with them is extraordinarily complicated in the US system. And there are so many people involved, so many different people involved. Jeff Abramson is back there from the Forum on Arms Trade. He can tell you all about it. Try to get him after this. It's really a complicated web of decisions. That entire web has been broken down into it's whatever President Biden says. And President Biden has been unwilling to condition aid to Israel or stop the support, except for once with the 2,000-pound bombs, which he paused. Everyone else I speak with, and yeah, we would have loved to have seen more resignations. Certainly they could have been more vocal. But nearly everyone else in the Biden administration that works on these issues has been devastated by what they are part of and what they have not been able to do. I hear, and this will go into the future of what I think about US policy. I hear a lot of, especially young people, tell me, which I am not anymore, tell me that international law is broken and it just needs to be replaced. Just eschew international law completely. I absolutely disagree with this. I love international law. The Geneva Conventions, that like I say I would tattoo it on my body, except that I don't have enough room. The law is terrific. I have not actually found a situation that the law would not cover, including with AI and other technologies and things that we're seeing. The problem is not the law, the problem is not the text of the law, the problem is implementation of the law, and the problem is the overlay of power on top of international law that allows some to use the law in some ways and others to completely eschew it and others to use it in different ways. And I think that's what, Phyllis, I need to think more about what you were saying about the rules-based order, but I think part of what you're saying is that it is this power structure on top of the laws that is actually what we're talking about. US law prohibits giving weapons to any partner government in cases where they are more likely, actually it's policy, not law, in cases where they are more likely than not to violate international law. And the United States is prohibited by domestic laws from giving weapons to governments that have violated international law. Now, when the United States has assessed this, when the Biden administration has assessed whether Israel has violated international law, it actually didn't say that it didn't violate international law. It said it probably has, but they have no specific instance or evidence to point to say that it has. Now, that's an incredible parsing of language. It is so nuanced that it's almost hard to believe, and of course, all of us can see what we see with our own eyes. Groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, Oxfam, all the rest have done extensive research. We have dedicated nearly a year of tremendous resources to finding the cases of violations of Israel's conduct. I think it will be hard for any next president to bring back the modicum of US credibility in this space that it had before. And by before, I don't even know when I'm talking about. Because if we actually look at US history, the US has always skirted international laws and domestic laws when it made sense to. I think most countries have, but no country has had the power and influence of the United States. And so it has a much larger impact when the United States does it. Talking about the future of US foreign policy. So Biden, I think, has really, against his rhetoric, so soaring rhetoric when he became president about democracy and human rights and the rules-based order and the global liberal order. As everyone knows, and it has become kind of a punchline here in Washington, human rights was not the center of foreign policy. Short-term gains for security, economic reasons, whatever it may have been, a fight against China, have overtaken human rights all over the place. A Saudi defense pact, a new defense agreement with the UAE when MBZ was here in Washington just this week. Prime Minister Modi coming to Washington without any public condemnation of what he is doing to religious minorities in the country. Over and over and over again, we see this. So we know that human rights was not at the center of foreign policy. The next president can make a decision to not pit human rights against all of the other interests that they will have, including security, economy, trade, stability in various regions. But they probably will, because I don't think there has ever been a president or an administration that has put human rights at the table in equal measure with all of the other US interests, or seen despite what they say, human rights and international law and these principles as part and parcel of security and stability and good economic practices. And of course, when we're thinking about this coming election, we're talking about two very different candidates. And of course, Human Rights Watch is a 501c3. I have to be very careful about what I say here, but the candidates could not be more different in how they think about human rights, democracy, international law. So it's kind of hard to say this one, here's my recommendations for both candidates, because they would look so completely different. However, first and foremost, stop sending weapons to Israel. Reconsider a Saudi defense pact that actually includes, if you're gonna do it, and I hope we don't, include human rights conditions. I mean, there's so many of these things that need to be reconsidered. It actually is it's an entire reconsideration of how they look at foreign policy, including taking into consideration the fact that I think the majority of the world's population is wanting human rights, is wanting freedoms. The United States has become so out of sync with the rest of the world. And we're seeing that now. We're gonna see it so much more, and I'm not sure that the Biden administration really gets it yet. I hope that a Harris or Trump administration would get it. I should probably leave it there. We can get into discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. And we have some questions coming in, but I wanna maybe follow up on some of the issues that were raised now and earlier in the day. I'll maybe give each one of you a question, and then feel free to elaborate or comment on your co-panelists' remarks here. Phyllis, we've been talking about the breakdown of the global order and the failures of the international legal system, and the possibility of maybe a new order emerging in which, countries in the global south are using their positions to influence global affairs. You've mentioned, South Africa, but do you think we're really seeing the breakdown of this order and the power imbalance that have existed since the establishment of this order? And feel free to comment on others as well.
Yeah, it's a very serious question. I think that the order, such as it wasn't ever really very orderly, but there was a kind of set of power relations, is changing. I don't think that means that we are inevitably moving nicely and politely into a multipolar world where everybody is equal and all of that. I think there are a lot of challenges ahead. A lot of the challenge to the U.S. as the leading power in this, what was for a period of time a really dominant unipolar organized policy for the world, are countries that are severely flawed in terms of human rights, environmental protections, labor rights. So if we look at, for example, the BRICS, which I think a lot of people were quite hopeful about for a while, when I look at the old BRICS, the original BRICS of 5, I see Brazil and South Africa as reasonable countries that are playing important roles in the world, are open on their domestic policies, although lots of challenges, lots of mistakes being made, but are kind of moving in the right direction. And then I see Russia, China, and India, where there are, these are horrific countries in terms of all those things: human rights, environmental protections, indigenous rights, women's rights. All of those issues are challenged, and women's rights in some ways less so in China, but in all these countries there are just huge contradictions. So it's not to say I would like to go back to replace the socialist world with the BRICS and then it'll all work out. No, it won't work out. It's part of it is states. States as an organizing tool, in my view, is not a very good one, but it's what we've got. It's how the world is organized. I don't see that changing anytime very soon. So I think that the question of how international law can be used becomes really, really important in holding countries accountable in some of these ways. And I think that's why the South African model with the ICJ is so doubly important, that it's not only the substance of this is the one thing that gives me some hope that there could be a way from outside of stopping the genocide, because I certainly don't see any evidence that any political force inside Israel, whether civil society, social movements, there is none that have the capacity to change anything there, in my view. So I see this as a potential for that. At the same time, it is proposing the notion of accountability being brought not only by wealthy, generally white, powerful countries against the countries of the global South. That it's a different reality that could provide the beginning of a model. And I think, I've got to say, I think the South Africans have handled it brilliantly in terms of particularly in terms of their relationship with civil society, their work with Palestinian civil society, with international human rights and other organizations, with civil society here in the US. You know, it's been an incredibly collaborative process. And that's something that's rare in my experience working at the UN and in other environments where you try and get to governments and they're like, why should I listen to you, you know? And we saw moments when that happens, when you have, as was true on February 15th of 2003, when the world said no to war around Iraq, and there were somewhere between 14 and 16 million people in the streets on one day saying the same thing. The world says no to war in a million different languages. On that day, there were a lot of governments that were on the side of those protesters, challenging the US and the Brits, right? But that doesn't happen by itself. It happens because movements get created. So I think it's in this context of the significance of this global movement, which isn't organized on a global way. It's not like there's Zoom meetings involving the whole world to figure out how do we build a movement for ceasefire. But there was a spontaneous recognition that ceasefire was the moment, that was the demand of the moment, that ceasefire was the key. And that in the United States, there's this incredibly broad movement. It's not very deep in many ways. It's not all people who understand settler colonialism and the roots of apartheid in Israel, or in South Africa for that matter. But it's big and it's broad and it's closer to those in power than the Palestinian rights movement has ever been, right? So that those things that were mentioned earlier about wouldn't it have been great if we had more resignations, I think you said that, Sarah, that the resignations were hugely important, resignations of political appointees. And then all those who didn't resign but wrote their letters and came out publicly, the 500 people at the State Department, the 1,000 people at USAID. My personal favorite was the White House interns. These are kids, right? They're the most ambitious kids in the country. They all want to be president. And yet, really, trust me, but they came out public, well, they weren't so public, they wore masks, they weren't stupid, they are ambitious. But they came out and said, you know, Mr. President, we are not the leaders of today, but we aspire to lead tomorrow, and we can't lead if this is the model we're given to lead on. So that's huge, that's huge.
Yeah.
So I think that there is some hope here, and it comes back to movements.
Thank you, Phyllis, and I want to give the chance to the other speakers to comment here in the last few minutes. You've mentioned the movement, and we've been hearing a lot from the movement demands to reform the international legal system and to really use international law to hold countries accountable. And so my question for you, Wadie, is it realistic to be talking about reforming international law or the international system? And how do we go about even starting to think about this or work towards maybe ensuring balance of power, fair accountability mechanisms, and so on, and enforcement?
Wow. Enforcement.
In
Yeah,
1 minute.
I got that one covered. So I think, you know, one of the, as I mentioned earlier, I think in my remarks, let's consider this more also about creating the record that, a lawyer, if they're doing their job properly, is going to create a proper record, because who knows how the enforcement part will take place. So I think there is this nice, it's not nice, but there is a full record, certainly a fuller one than before these various cases got filed, that shines the light on what the Israeli military is doing with the outright complicity of the US government, the German government, et cetera, the British government. And so there's this record there from which we can kind of really evaluate this claim of genocide, which is, I think, a massive achievement in and of itself, as little as that means to the people in Gaza or southern Lebanon, the West Bank, and I understand. But they're two separate efforts. I think with respect to enforcement, you're going to see things like, organic movements of people. So, I'm sure many of you have probably read the reports about how McDonald's profits are way down. Starbucks profits are way down. Many American companies have suffered because of their identification via the United States with what Israel is doing in Palestine and the Gaza Strip more specifically. And as a result, we've seen, for example, I just spoke with people in Jordan, and they said nobody drinks Coke in Jordan anymore. Nobody touches American products. The whole country is involved in its own version of boycott and divesting and sanction, even though the government is another story. But you're seeing these kind of grassroots responses to the enormity of the Israeli crimes as kind of sponsored by the United States. So there's this action that I think we can look at going beyond, the idea of formal measures or formal awards that are enforced by, kind of armed authorities. That's not happening for the time being, but people are taking these things into their own hands, especially when we look at it from the American perspective. 37 states have anti-BDS laws, right? So it's really kind of striking to see the difference between what's taking place outside the borders of this country and what we're kind of stuck with here.
Thank you, Wadie. And you've mentioned the anti-BDS laws in the U.S., and I want to maybe end with a question for Sarah, one from the audience, and then I'll add to it. And the question says, are there any mechanisms to ensure that presidents or members of Congress adhere to international law and human rights law, and also U.S. laws as well, or policies and regulations? Are there any accountability mechanisms? And recently, and it was mentioned earlier today, there's been an investigation by ProPublica into the issue of Israel blocking humanitarian aid, and Secretary of State in a way denying that in order to ensure that military aid continues to go to Israel. Are there any mechanisms for accountability?
Yes, they are called elections, and we have one coming up in November. I'm serious. It's about people power. It is about movements. It is about elections. It is about Americans actually understanding what is going on in the world and holding their own government accountable. ICJ, ICC, the Human Rights Council, the UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council, all of these things, I love them. If we didn't have them, we'd be creating them. They're not perfect. In fact, a lot of the time, they're incredible failures at actually holding states accountable. But they're the ones who are finding the evidence. They're the ones who are putting the international pressure together. They're the ones that the Global South can use to name and shame the United States and other donors to Israel. But what it comes down to is the election here in the United States. I would say, what happened, what ProPublica did was investigated this leaked memo that USAID had sent to the White House and the State Department saying that Israel was intentionally blocking aid. It was not getting through. So what we know from that, and we knew this already, very helpful to have the leaked memo, that the Biden administration knew that aid was being blocked by Israel. I do not think, I think that is different from saying that the Secretary of State overlooked that fact in order to continue supplying weapons to Israel. I think he did not act on that fact because he believed that he could ensure more humanitarian aid gets into Gaza by negotiating with Israel and having that diplomatic relationship rather than cutting off weapons. That is truly, in every meeting I've been at with the senior-most Biden officials, that is truly what they believed. That if they negotiated, instead of putting weapons on the table as leverage, they would be able to get farther. We know that that has been an epic failure. However, I do want to say that I think that the worst intentions of the Biden administration officials are probably not exactly correct. That doesn't take away the failure of what they have done and the fact that they have been violating U.S. domestic laws.
Thank you, Sarah. And we're a couple of minutes over time, so that brings us to the end of this session and the end of the conference for today. I'd like to thank all of you for being with us today and for your excellent remarks and analyses. I'd like to thank all the speakers that were with us today since the morning for their contributions, and for some of them for traveling to be here. Thank you to all of them. Thanks to the staff at Arab Center Washington, D.C. for their excellent and dedication in putting this conference together. I would like to thank the Executive Director of Arab Center Washington, D.C., Khalil Jahshan, and our Board of Directors and Academic Advisory Board for their continuous support, guidance, and leadership. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you, the audience, for joining us throughout the day here at the National Press Club and online. Please continue to follow our work at arabcenterdc.org, and we hope to see you at our future events. Thank you.